Have you ever had one of those moments where you feel like you've lived this exact day before? A sense of déjà vu so strong, it makes you wonder if history truly does move in circles. Now imagine that feeling, not just on a personal scale, but woven into the very fabric of human history, events, names, and outcomes mirroring one another across centuries, defying logic and coincidence alike. It's as if some unseen thread connects moments that should have no business being linked, creating patterns so strange and inexplicable they challenge everything we think we know about chance, fate, and time itself. Today, we're setting out on a journey into some of history's most baffling mysteries, not just isolated coincidences, but recurring themes that echo through the ages. These aren't mere quirks of fate, they're moments where history seems to rhyme, where figures separated by generations or continents find their lives intertwined in ways that feel almost intentional. From leaders who shared eerily parallel rises and falls, to disasters that repeated under nearly identical circumstances, these patterns invite us to question whether there's something more at play in our collective story than random chance. In this video, we'll explore 25 of these astonishing historical coincidences, each one a puzzle piece in a larger, mysterious design. Some will send chills down your spine, others might make you rethink how interconnected our world truly is. So settle in, open your mind to the possibilities, and join me as we unravel these enigmas together. You might just walk away seeing history and maybe even your own life in a whole new light. And where better to begin than with one of the most famous and chilling historical parallels of all, the uncanny connections between the assassinations of Presidents Abraham Lincoln and John F. Kennedy. At first glance, these two events, separated by nearly a century, seem like tragic but isolated moments in American history. But when you lay the details side by side, the sheer number of coincidences becomes almost unbelievable, sparking endless debates about fate, conspiracy, and the possibility that history isn't just written but perhaps even rehearsed. Both men were tragically shot on a Friday in the presence of their wives. For Lincoln, it was a night at Ford's Theater in 1865. For Kennedy, it was a motorcade through Dealey Plaza in 1963. And the similarities only deepen from there. Their assassins, John Wilkes Booth and Lee Harvey Oswald, both carried the weight of three-part names. Both killers themselves met violent ends before they could ever stand trial, leaving a trail of unanswered questions in their wake. Even the political aftermath echoes across the decades. Both presidents were succeeded by men named Andrew Johnson, who followed Lincoln, and Lyndon B. Johnson, who took the oath after Kennedy, and incredibly, both vice presidents were Southern senators, stepping into the nation's highest office during periods of immense social upheaval and grief. It's a layer of symmetry that feels too precise to be mere chance. These parallels have done more than just fuel late-night conversations. They've become a cornerstone of modern conspiracy theories. For many, the sheer volume of mirrored details suggests a hidden pattern, a blueprint perhaps that implies something far more orchestrated than a random act of violence. It challenges us to ask whether we're seeing the work of fate, or if these echoes are the fingerprints of something, or someone else entirely, weaving a repeating pattern into the fabric of American history. But the connections go even deeper than the names and dates we often hear. Both Abraham Lincoln and John F. Kennedy experienced the profound personal tragedy of losing a child while in office. Lincoln's beloved son, William Wallace Lincoln, known as Willie, died of typhoid fever at just 11 years old in 1862, a loss that plunged the president into a deep, lasting grief. Exactly 1 century later, the Kennedys' newborn son, Patrick Bouvier Kennedy, passed away after just 2 days of life in August of 1963 due to complications from a lung disease. The heartbreak of a father burying his son, a pain unimaginable to most, became another stark, sorrowful parallel in their presidential journeys. These intricate patterns have woven their way far beyond history books and into the very fabric of our culture. The Lincoln-Kennedy coincidences have been dissected in countless documentaries, served as a pivotal plot device in novels like Stephen King's 11/22/63, and are a staple in television shows exploring the unexplained. They fuel passionate debates among historians and skeptics alike. Some see them as a classic example of apophenia, the human tendency to find meaningful patterns in random data, while others argue the sheer volume of mirrored details points to something that defies simple statistical explanation. This enduring fascination speaks to a fundamental human desire to find order in chaos, to see a narrative in what might otherwise feel like random tragedy. The story of these two presidents offers a strange comfort, a suggestion that perhaps even the most shocking events are part of a larger, if incomprehensible, design. It transforms their assassinations from isolated moments of national trauma into a continuing mystery, one that continues to captivate and haunt us, ensuring its place as perhaps the most famous historical coincidence of all time. Now, if the story of Lincoln and Kennedy feels like history rhyming across time, our next coincidence suggests something even more unsettling, that sometimes fiction doesn't just imitate life, but appears to predict it with an almost prophetic clarity. 14 years before the RMS Titanic met its tragic end in the icy waters of the North Atlantic, a largely unknown American author named Morgan Robertson wrote a novella titled Futility. It was published in 1898, and its plot centered around the sinking of an enormous, supposedly unsinkable ocean liner, the name of this fictional vessel. The Titan. The similarities between Robertson's Titan and the real-life Titanic are so numerous and specific, they transcend the realm of simple coincidence and venture into the utterly uncanny. Both ships were hailed as the largest and most luxurious passenger liners of their time, each declared practically unsinkable due to their advanced design and watertight compartments. The Titan was described as around 800 feet long. The Titanic measured about 882. Both were triple-screw propellers capable of high speeds for their era. Perhaps most chilling are the shared circumstances of their demise. Robertson's narrative has the Titan setting out on its ill-fated maiden voyage across the Atlantic in the month of April. On a cold, clear night, traveling at high speed despite warnings of dangerous ice fields, it strikes an iceberg and sinks. The lack of sufficient lifeboats on board, a critical plot point in the novel, results in a catastrophic loss of life. Every single one of these harrowing details would be mirrored with terrifying precision on the night of April 14, 1912. This astonishing parallel has, understandably, fueled speculation for over a century. Could Morgan Robertson have possessed some form of precognition, a window into a future he was never meant to see? Or was he simply a keen observer of his time, whose imaginative speculation landed uncomfortably close to the truth? The late 19th and early 20th centuries were a golden age of shipbuilding, a fierce competition between nations and shipping lines to construct ever larger, faster, and more opulent vessels. The risks of transatlantic travel, particularly the threat of icebergs in the North Atlantic shipping lanes, were well-known maritime hazards. Robertson, a former sailor himself, was writing within this context. His story was a work of cautionary fiction, a tale of human hubris and the dangerous assumption that technology could ever fully conquer nature. He tapped into a very real anxiety of the era. In that light, his predictions seem less like supernatural foresight and more like an educated and tragically accurate guess about where the industry's trajectory could lead. Yet the sheer specificity is what continues to haunt us. It wasn't just a story about a big ship that hit an iceberg. The name, the size, the month, the cause, the alignment is staggering. This coincidence has cemented the novel Futility in the annals of the unexplained, a permanent footnote to one of history's greatest maritime disasters. It serves as a powerful, sobering reminder of the thin line between imaginative warning and devastating reality, leaving us to wonder if some stories are destined to be told twice. This eerie pattern, known to many as the Curse of Tippecanoe or the 20-year presidential death cycle, presents one of the most persistent and spine-tingling coincidences in American political history. It begins with William Henry Harrison, elected in 1840. His inauguration day was bitterly cold, yet he delivered the longest inaugural address in American history without a coat or hat. He developed pneumonia and died just 1 month into his term, setting a tragic precedent. From that point forward, every single president elected in a year ending in 0 for the next 120 years would die while serving in office. Abraham Lincoln, elected in 1860, was tragically assassinated in 1865. James A. Garfield, elected in 1880, was shot by a disgruntled office seeker in 1881 and died weeks later from infections related to his wounds. William McKinley, elected in 1900, was assassinated by an anarchist in 1901. The pattern held firm into the 20th century with Warren G. Harding, elected in 1920, who died suddenly from a heart attack or a stroke in 1923 amidst swirling scandals within his administration. Franklin D. Roosevelt, elected to his 3rd term in 1940, passed away from a cerebral hemorrhage in 1945, just months into that term. And as we've already discussed, John F. Kennedy, elected in 1960, was assassinated in 1963. 7 presidents across 7 zero-year elections, each meeting a premature end in the White House. To many, this was far more than a statistical anomaly. It was a curse, and its origins were traced back to a moment of profound betrayal and conflict. The story goes that the curse was placed upon William Henry Harrison himself, harking back to his time as a military officer and governor of the Indiana Territory. In 1811, Harrison fought against a confederation of Native American tribes led by the Shawnee chief Tecumseh and his brother Tenskwatawa, known as the Prophet. Harrison's forces defeated them at the Battle of Tippecanoe, a victory that burnished his reputation but also involved the destruction of a sacred native settlement called Prophetstown. According to legend, a deeply angered Tecumseh, or in some versions, his brother the Prophet, conjured a curse proclaiming that Harrison would not win the presidency, or if he did, he would not finish his term, and that every great chief elected every 20 years after would also die. Harrison's swift death seemed to confirm the curse's power, launching a cycle of fate that gripped the nation's highest office for over a century. For generations, this pattern fueled superstition and dread, becoming a staple of American folklore. The zero-year election became a moment of national anxiety, a date circled with a sense of impending doom. Then came 1980 and the election of Ronald Reagan. The curse, which had held for 140 years, was on everyone's mind. And then, on March 30th, 1981, just 69 days into his presidency, John Hinckley Jr. attempted to assassinate Reagan outside a Washington, D.C. hotel. The president was shot in the chest and critically wounded, but thanks to the swift actions of his Secret Service detail and the skill of his surgeons, he survived and made a full recovery. Reagan's survival was widely seen as the event that finally broke the curse of Tippecanoe. His predecessor, Jimmy Carter, elected in 1976, had also survived his term, meaning the curse did not apply to non-zero-year elections. But Reagan's cheating of death in the face of the zero-year pattern seemed to dispel the ancient legend. Since then, George W. Bush, elected in 2000, also survived his 2 terms in office, despite facing significant dangers including the September 11th attacks and multiple security threats. Skeptics, of course, have a different view. They point to the law of truly large numbers, arguing that with a limited sample size and over a long period, strange clusters are statistically inevitable. They note that several presidents who died in office, like Zachary Taylor, were not elected in 0 years, while many who served during times of great danger survived. Yet the power of the story endures. It speaks to a deep-seated human fascination with patterns, with the idea that history is not random but moves in cycles of fate and retribution, a narrative so compelling that it became woven into the very fabric of American myth. Moving from the grand, cyclical patterns of presidential curses, we find an equally astonishing story of survival, one that hinges not on a decades-long legend, but on a single, miraculous moment of failed technology and sheer luck. The year was 1835, and America's 7th president, the famously iron-willed Andrew Jackson, was attending a funeral in the Capitol building. As he left the service, a mentally unstable house painter named Richard Lawrence stepped from the crowd, raised a single shot daring a pistol, and fired at the president's back from point-blank range. The hammer fell, but instead of a gunshot, there was only a sharp click, a misfire. In the chaos of that frozen instant, Jackson didn't flee. Enraged, the 67-year-old former general did what came naturally. He turned and advanced on his would-be assassin, raising his trademark hickory cane to strike the man down. Lawrence, utterly unfazed, dropped the first pistol, produced a second, identically loaded weapon from his coat, and aimed it directly at Jackson's heart. He pulled the trigger. For the second time, the cap ignited, but the powder in the chamber failed to fire. In an age before Secret Service protection, Andrew Jackson's life was saved by nothing more than 2 separate and statistically improbable mechanical failures. The public and the press were quick to label it a miracle. Jackson's supporters saw it as divine intervention, a sign that their champion was protected by Providence itself. Investigators, looking for a more worldly explanation, later determined that the weather that day was unusually damp, and that the black powder in Lawrence's pistols had likely become too moist to ignite properly. This simple forensic detail, however, does little to dilute the sheer improbability of the event. For both guns to fail independently under the immense stress of the moment remains a 1 in a million occurrence. The odds were so astronomically against it that the coincidence feels less like chance and more like fate. But the coincidences surrounding this event extend beyond the misfires themselves. Richard Lawrence, it was discovered, was born in England around 1801. That very same year, Andrew Jackson was appointed a colonel in the Tennessee militia, formally beginning the military career that would eventually make him a national hero during the War of 1812. The assassin and his target, their lives linked by that specific year, entered the world on a collision course set decades in advance. Lawrence, who believed he was the rightful heir to the English throne and that Jackson was withholding his payments, saw the president not as a man, but as a symbol of the power that had wronged him, a delusion that bizarrely mirrored the very real political hatred Jackson inspired in his opponents. This assassination attempt was a stark wake-up call for a young nation. While there had been scuffles and threats before, this was the first clear attempt to kill a sitting president. It forced a national conversation about the vulnerability of the nation's leader and the intense, often violent, passions of the political arena. Jackson's incredible escape, a story of 2 clicks that thundered through history, reminds us that sometimes the most pivotal moments hinge on the smallest of details, a bit of damp air, a grain of powder that refused to burn. It's a testament to the fragile thread on which history often hangs, a thread that, for Andrew Jackson, did not break. Yet even as London smoldered, another powerful current of thought was flowing through the public consciousness, one that transformed a terrible accident into a terrifying omen. For decades, a form of popular prophecy known as Bible mathematics or numerology had been gaining traction. Practitioners would calculate the numerical value of names or dates, searching for hidden, divine messages within the scripture. And one number held a particular and dreadful power, 666, the infamous number of the beast from the book of Revelation, a symbol of evil, the Antichrist, and the end times. When the fire erupted in 1666, the year itself seemed to scream its purpose. To a population already reeling from the recent horrors of the Great Plague, the inferno felt less like a random disaster and more like a direct fulfillment of this apocalyptic prophecy. The flames were not merely consuming wood and thatch, they were purging a city stained by sin, a divine punishment foretold in the most chilling code. Preachers and pamphleteers were quick to seize upon this connection, their sermons and writings fanning the flames of superstition as effectively as the east wind had spread the fire. They pointed to the moral failings of the city, its decadence and vice, as the reason for its fiery judgment. In the soot-covered faces of the survivors, many saw not just grief, but the terrified acknowledgement that they had witnessed a chapter from the Bible played out in their very streets. Our most vivid and human window into this catastrophic event comes from the detailed diaries of Samuel Pepys, a senior naval administrator whose personal account provides a ground-level view of the chaos. He chronicled his own disbelief as the fire grew, his desperate efforts to save his own possessions, and his eventual journey by boat to inform King Charles II of the sheer scale of the destruction. In one particularly famous entry, he describes burying his prized wine and Parmesan cheese in his garden to save it from the flames. His writings capture the strange mix of the mundane and the apocalyptic, the concern for daily comforts existing alongside the terrifying realization that the entire world they knew was vanishing. It was Pepys who recorded the king's orders to create fire breaks by demolishing houses, a critical strategy that ultimately helped contain the blaze, and his account remains the definitive human story of the disaster. From the ashes, however, a new London was compelled to rise. The fire's utter destruction, while tragic, presented an unprecedented opportunity for urban renewal. The old, cramped medieval city of wooden buildings and narrow alleyways was gone. In its place, architect Sir Christopher Wren presented ambitious plans for a modern metropolis of wide, straight boulevards and public squares built from brick and stone. While much of his grand vision was never fully realized due to cost and the urgent need for rebuilding, his influence was profound. He was entrusted with designing a new St. Paul's Cathedral, along with over 50 other city churches, their steeples forever changing the London skyline. New building regulations were swiftly enacted, mandating brick construction and wider streets, fundamentally rewriting the rules of urban life to prevent such a catastrophe from ever happening again. The Great Fire of London thus stands at a fascinating crossroads in history. It is a story of a simple, accidental spark that grew into an unimaginable catastrophe. It is also a story of powerful coincidence, where a date on the calendar aligned perfectly with a deep-seated cultural superstition, allowing people to make sense of chaos through the lens of divine wrath. And finally, it is a story of profound human resilience. Out of the superstitious ashes of 1666 emerged not just a new city, but the very blueprint for the modern, fire-resistant, and rationally planned urban centers we know today. It serves as a permanent reminder that even our greatest disasters can contain the seeds of progress, and that our search for meaning, whether in numbers or in bricks and mortar, is an enduring part of the human spirit. But sometimes the coincidences that swirl around a world-changing event are not found in grand prophecies or presidential cycles, but etched onto a small metal license plate. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, is universally recognized as the spark that ignited the First World War. Yet, clinging to that moment is a smaller, more intricate mystery involving the very car he was riding, in a detail so strange it seems to hint at a fate that was written not just in history books, but in the very machinery of the event itself. The automobile was a 2011 Greff and Stiff Double Phaeton, a luxurious open-top touring car loaned for the day by a man named Count Franz Harrach. Its license plate read a 3118. In the grief-stricken and superstitious aftermath of the war, a startling interpretation of this number began to circulate. If you read the letter as standing for armistice and the Roman numeral Roman 3 as the number 11, the entire plate could be read as a 1118 armistice, 1111-18. This was the exact date and time the Great War ended, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month in 1918. It was as if the vehicle carrying the Archduke to his death had been branded from the very beginning with the cryptic final answer to the conflict his death would begin. Of course, this is a classic example of retroactive pattern seeking. The license plate system in Sarajevo at the time used letters and numbers sequentially. A 3118 was simply the next plate in the registry, assigned without a second thought. There was no hidden code, no prophetic intent. Yet, the human mind is irresistibly drawn to these connections, especially when they bookend a catastrophe of such immense scale. The coincidence provided a narrative symmetry that was almost poetic, a sense that even in the chaotic randomness of a political murder, there was a dark, preordained order to the events that would unfold over the next 4 bloody years. But the story of this accursed automobile does not end in Sarajevo. The vehicle, seemingly touched by tragedy, developed a grim reputation in the years that followed. After the war, it was acquired by the governor of Yugoslavia, a man named Dr. Erich Skorzeny. In its first few years under his ownership, the car was involved in a series of bizarre accidents. On one occasion, it reportedly crashed, killing 2 of its passengers and leaving the driver, though some accounts say it was a different occupant paralyzed from the waist down. In another incident, it is said to have rolled over, claiming the lives of several more people. With each new tragedy, the legend of the car's curse grew stronger. The final owner of the vehicle, a Swiss doctor, apparently became so unnerved by its dark history and the relentless string of misfortune that he donated it to a museum in Vienna in 1951, hoping to finally lay its ghosts to rest. Whether one believes in curses or not, the series of events is undeniably strange. A car present at the single most consequential assassination of the 20th century goes on to be involved in multiple fatal accidents, affecting nearly every subsequent owner with tragedy. It's a chain of coincidence that transforms the Greff and Stift from a mere historical artifact into a character in its own right, a symbol of the relentless, unforgiving sweep of history that seemed to consume everyone who came into contact with it. This tiny detail, a simple license plate, became woven into the powerful lore of the First World War because it speaks to a deep human need. We look at the immense, senseless slaughter of the war and search for meaning, for a sign that such suffering was not entirely random. The interpreted prophecy of a 3118 offers a chilling, almost comforting sense of closure. It suggests that from the very first shot, the end was already known, that the conflict had a built-in expiration date. It is a coincidence that serves as a dark bookmark in history, linking the first page of the war directly to its last, and forever tying the Archduke's fate to the peace that would finally, mercifully, come for a shattered continent. So far, our coincidences have involved grand historical figures and world-altering events, but sometimes the most astonishing patterns emerge from a much simpler source, pure mathematical chance. And few stories illustrate the sheer, breathtaking power of probability and our profound inability to understand it better than what transpired on a single night at the Monte Carlo casino in the summer of 1913. It was here that a simple roulette wheel became the stage for one of the most statistically improbable events ever recorded, a moment that would bankrupt fortunes and sear itself into gambling history. The game was straightforward, as it always is, a spinning wheel with alternating black and red pockets and a small white ball destined to land in one of them. The crowd, a mix of wealthy socialites and desperate gamblers, watched as the croupier set the wheel in motion. It landed on black, then again and again. With each successive spin, the tension in the room began to coil tighter. A run of 5, then 10, then 15 blacks in a row is unusual but not unheard of. But as the number climbed into the 20s, the atmosphere shifted from excitement to something closer to collective delirium. The players, gripped by the gambler's fallacy, the mistaken belief that past random events can influence future ones, began to pour their money onto red. They were convinced that a correction was not just due, but absolutely inevitable. The universe, in their minds, had to balance the scales, yet the ball had no memory. Each spin was an independent event, utterly disconnected from the last. The odds of landing on black remained just under 50-50 every single time. But the probability of a sequence of one specific outcome repeating over and over compounds exponentially. By the time the wheel landed on black for the 26th consecutive time, the odds of that precise sequence occurring were a staggering one in approximately 66.6 million. It was a near mathematical impossibility playing out in real time. The casino raked in millions of francs as bet after bet on red crashed and burned. Stories from the time tell of players losing their entire life savings in a matter of hours, their faith in a balanced world shattered by the relentless, indifferent spin of the wheel. This event did more than just make a few casino owners immensely wealthy. It fundamentally changed the conversation around probability and risk. For mathematicians and statisticians, the Monte Carlo run became a textbook example of the difference between the probability of a single event and the probability of a sequence. It was a perfect, if devastating, real-world lesson in independence and the law of large numbers. For the public and gambling regulators, it was a horrifying demonstration of how quickly fortune could be obliterated by a fluke of chance. In the years that followed, the story was used to argue for stricter gambling laws and better education on the nature of risk, a cautionary tale against believing too strongly in a system's tendency to correct itself. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the 1913 run, however, is its powerful contribution to gambling superstition. To this day, seasoned players in casinos around the world will reference the Monte Carlo fallacy, another name for the gambler's fallacy. They'll watch a table where red has hit 5 times in a row and still feel a powerful, almost primal urge to bet on black, even though they know intellectually the odds haven't changed. The ghost of that night in Monaco serves as a permanent reminder that human psychology is often the weakest link when facing the cold, impartial logic of randomness. We are pattern-seeking creatures by nature, and sometimes the most dangerous coincidence of all is when we think we've found a pattern where none truly exists. From the cold impartiality of a roulette wheel to the deeply personal bonds of history's architects, our next coincidence feels less like a roll of the dice and more like a final, poignant note in a carefully composed symphony. It's a story that brings us back to America's founding, to the lives of two giants whose fierce rivalry, political partnership, and eventual reconciliation became the very embodiment of the nation's turbulent early spirit, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. And their final act together would be so perfectly timed, so rich with symbolism, that it would forever cement their legacy not just as presidents, but as inseparable figures in the American story. Their relationship was a complex tapestry woven with threads of deep respect, bitter ideological conflict, and ultimately profound friendship. In the heat of the Revolution, they were close allies, the brilliant mind from Virginia and the fiery advocate from Massachusetts working in tandem to help birth a new nation. Jefferson, the quiet intellectual, drafted the Declaration of Independence. Adams, its greatest champion, fiercely argued for its passage in the Continental Congress. But as the new government took shape, their paths diverged dramatically. Adams, a Federalist, believed in a strong central government to guide the young republic. Jefferson, a Democratic Republican, championed states' rights and a more agrarian, decentralized vision of America. This fundamental disagreement turned them into political enemies during the volatile first presidential elections. The bitterness culminated in the election of 1800, one of the most vicious in American history. Jefferson challenged the incumbent Adams, and the campaign was filled with personal attacks and slanderous accusations from partisan newspapers. Jefferson's supporters accused Adams of having a hideous hermaphroditical character and wanting to crown himself king. Adams' allies claimed Jefferson was an atheist and a coward. When Jefferson narrowly won, Adams was so embittered he left the capital for his home in Quincy, Massachusetts, before dawn on the day of the inauguration, refusing to attend the ceremony. For more than a decade, these two pillars of the revolution did not exchange a single word, yet time has a way of sanding down the sharp edges of conflict. In 1811, a mutual friend, Dr. Benjamin Rush, managed to orchestrate a reconciliation, persuading them to begin a correspondence. What followed was one of the most remarkable exchanges in American history. Over the next 14 years, they exchanged over 150 letters, discussing everything from philosophy and religion to their memories of the revolution and their hopes for the country's future. The old political animosities melted away, replaced by the shared perspective of elder statesmen who had outlived nearly all of their contemporaries. They rediscovered the deep fondness and intellectual kinship that had first drawn them together, their friendship becoming a powerful testament to the idea that what unites us can be far stronger than what divides us. As the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence approached in 1826, both men were in rapidly declining health. They were the last surviving signers of that sacred document, living relics of a momentous summer a half-century prior. The entire nation was preparing a grand jubilee to celebrate, and the symbolism of these two patriarchs, once again united in spirit, was not lost on anyone. But neither Jefferson at Monte Carlo nor Adams in Quincy were expected to live to see the day. What happened next, however, would defy all expectation and enter the realm of national myth. On the morning of July 4, 1826, Thomas Jefferson passed away at his beloved Monte Carlo in Virginia. Several hours later, and hundreds of miles to the north, John Adams lay on his deathbed in Massachusetts. Unaware that his friend and rival had already departed, Adams stirred, and with what would be his final words, whispered a phrase that was both a statement of fact and a hopeful sentiment: "Thomas Jefferson survives." He then fell silent and died. The news of their simultaneous passing, on the very anniversary of the document they had both worked so tirelessly to create, swept across the young nation like a shockwave. It was a coincidence so perfect, so poetically resonant, that many Americans could not accept it as mere chance. To a nation steeped in the belief of divine providence, the timing was seen as a clear sign of God's special favor upon the American experiment. Newspapers of the era described it as a visible and palpable intervention of the Almighty, a final seal of approval upon the work of the founding generation. It transformed Adams and Jefferson from mere mortals into something closer to national saints, their deaths a shared sacrifice that bookended the first great chapter of American history. The event was commemorated for decades in sermons and 4th of July orations, serving as a powerful unifying myth for a country that was often fracturing along sectional and political lines. Of course, skeptics offer a more grounded explanation. Both men were elderly and gravely ill. Adams was 90 years old and Jefferson 83. The will to hold on for a symbolically significant date is a powerful psychological force, a phenomenon well documented in hospice care. It is entirely possible that both men, consciously or not, fought to stay alive until the nation's birthday, a final act of patriotic duty. Yet even if we accept this rational view, the sheer improbability remains stunning. That these two specific men, with their deeply intertwined lives, would both succumb on that specific date feels like more than just a happy accident of timing. It feels like history itself offering a moment of profound, meaningful closure, a final, harmonious chord in the complex and beautiful relationship between two American giants. Their story reminds us that our lives are often connected in ways we can scarcely imagine, and that sometimes the most powerful coincidences are those that speak directly to the heart of who we are. But if the story of Adams and Jefferson represents a poetic closing of a historical circle, our next coincidence takes us to a place where time itself seemed to bend, creating a moment of such perfect navigational and calendrical symmetry that it feels less like an accident and more like a feat of temporal engineering. This is the story of the SS Warrimoo, a passenger steamship plying the tranquil waters of the Pacific Ocean on the final night of the 19th century. Its captain, John Phillips, was a seasoned and precise navigator, and as the clock ticked down toward a new year and, momentously, a new century, he conceived of an audacious plan. He wouldn't just celebrate the dawn of 1900, he would position his ship so that it physically straddled the line between the old world and the new. His goal was to locate the precise point where the equator intersects the international dateline. This is a navigational abstraction, a point on the open ocean that exists only on maps and charts, constantly shifting with the Earth's curvature and the agreed-upon conventions of timekeeping. To find it required incredible skill. Captain Phillips spent December 31, 1899, making meticulous celestial observations, taking readings from the sun and stars to pinpoint his vessel's exact longitude and latitude. As midnight approached, he gave the order for a series of careful course corrections. The crew, now invested in the captain's eccentric mission, worked with focused intensity. Then he announced they had achieved it. The SS Warrimoo was positioned perfectly. According to the logbook and the crew's accounts, the ship's bow was just across the international dateline, placing it in the first few minutes of January 1, 1900. Meanwhile, the stern remained on the other side of the line, still languishing in the final moments of December 31, 1899. But the coincidence went even deeper. Not only was the ship straddling 2 days, it was also bisected by the equator. This meant the forward half of the ship was in the southern hemisphere, experiencing the summer of a new century, while the aft section was in the northern hemisphere, still in the winter of the past. In one breathtakingly precise moment, the Warrimoo allegedly existed in 2 different days, 2 different months, 2 different years, 2 different centuries, and 2 different hemispheres simultaneously. The sheer improbability of this event is staggering. The Pacific Ocean is vast, and the chances of hitting this exact imaginary coordinate, a moving target defined by human convention, not geography, are astronomically low. It would be like threading a needle while riding a horse on a rolling ship. Skeptics have rightly questioned the veracity of the story over the years, suggesting it may be more of a beloved maritime legend than a thoroughly documented historical fact. Navigational technology in 1899, while advanced, was not infallible. The story's persistence, however, is a testament to its powerful appeal. It was a tale perfectly suited for the smoking rooms and dinner parties of the era, a clever anecdote that spoke to human mastery over the natural world and the abstract concepts that govern our lives. Beyond the technical wonder, the story of the Warrimoo serves as a powerful metaphor. It freezes a single, fleeting moment of transition, making the abstract passage of time physically tangible. We can picture a passenger walking from the stern to the bow, literally stepping from the 19th century into the 20th. It visualizes the arbitrary nature of the calendars and clocks we use to impose order on the chaos of existence. The international dateline is a human invention, a necessary fiction for global society to function, and the Warrimoo's position highlighted the strange, illogical seams in that very system. It was a ship parked directly on a crack in time. This coincidence resonates because it speaks to a universal human experience, standing on a threshold between the past and the future. The end of a century is always a time for reflection and anticipation, and the Warrimoo's journey physicalized that feeling for everyone who hears the tale. It's a story that challenges our linear perception of history, suggesting that the boundaries we draw between eras are often just as fluid and permeable as the ocean itself. Whether entirely true or beautifully embellished, the legend of the SS Warrimoo endures as one of history's most elegant and thought-provoking coincidences, a perfect storm of human ambition, navigational skill, and the wonderfully strange nature of time. While the story of the Warrimoo is a breathtaking display of human precision navigating the abstract, our next coincidence delves into a far more intimate and eerie realm, the world of dreams and premonitions. It centers on one of America's most revered leaders, Abraham Lincoln, and a haunting dream he experienced just days before his assassination, a vision so vivid and specific that it has become one of the most compelling and debated personal omens in all of history. This incident pulls back the curtain on the private anxieties of a leader under immense strain and taps into the 19th century fascination with the supernatural and the symbolic. The account comes from a close friend of the Lincolns, Ward Hill Lamon, whose memoirs provide the most detailed record. Just a week or two before that fateful night at Ford's Theater, Lincoln shared a troubling dream. He described finding himself wandering through the silent, echoing rooms of the White House, drawn by the sound of subdued sobs. He followed the mournful sound until he entered the East Room, where he was met with a shocking and macabre sight. The room was draped in funeral black, and in the center sat a grand catafalque, a raised platform used to support a coffin. Around it stood soldiers acting as guards, while a long line of grieving citizens filed past to pay their respects. In the dream, Lincoln approached one of the soldiers and asked who had died in the White House. The soldier's reply was chillingly direct: the president. He was killed by an assassin. This was not an isolated moment of unease for Lincoln. Those in his inner circle noted that he had been speaking with an unusual frequency about threats on his life and a persistent feeling of impending doom. Just on the day of his assassination, he reportedly told his bodyguard, Ward Hill Lamon, about another ominous dream involving a ship moving with great speed toward a dark, indefinite shore, a classic symbol of death in many cultural dream interpretations. While historians debate the absolute accuracy of these accounts, they align perfectly with the well-documented melancholy and fatalism that often characterized Lincoln's personality. He had carried the immense weight of a civil war for 4 years, a burden that would have given anyone a sense of looming tragedy. To understand the power of this story, we must view it through the lens of the 19th century. This was an era far more receptive to the idea of omens, prophetic dreams, and spiritual signs than our modern, scientifically oriented world. The lines between the natural and the supernatural were often blurred. The practice of spiritualism, which sought to communicate with the dead, was widespread, and dreams were commonly believed to be messages from God or glimpses into the future. In this context, Lincoln's dream wasn't seen as a simple nightmare born of stress. To many of his contemporaries, it was a genuine premonition, a divine warning that went unheeded. The impact of this story on Lincoln's legacy cannot be overstated. It transformed his death from a mere political murder into an event of Shakespearean tragedy, a fate that he himself seemed to have foreseen yet been powerless to prevent. It added a profound layer of pathos to his story, reinforcing the image of a martyr who sacrificed himself for the Union. This narrative of the doomed prophet, aware of his fate, became deeply woven into the national mythology, making his assassination feel even more destined and inescapable. Beyond Lincoln, his experience invites us to consider a broader pattern of premonitions among world leaders and figures of historical significance. From the ancient Roman Emperor Julius Caesar being warned to beware the Ides of March by a seer, to countless anecdotes of soldiers dreaming of their own deaths on the battlefield, history is littered with such accounts. Psychologists today might explain these events through the lens of the high anxiety hypothesis, the idea that when a person is under extreme and constant stress, their subconscious mind can manifest these fears in incredibly vivid and symbolic dreams. What makes Lincoln's case so extraordinary isn't necessarily the dream itself, but the terrifying, precise accuracy with which it seemed to predict the very public nature of his mourning, with his coffin indeed lying in state in the East Room of the White House exactly as he had seen it. The Lincoln Dream premonition stands at the crossroads of coincidence, psychology, and legend. Whether one interprets it as a genuine psychic event, a stunning example of the subconscious mind connecting the dots of perceived danger, or a story embellished after the fact to fit the narrative, its power endures. It forces us to confront the unsettling possibility that sometimes the most inexplicable coincidences are the ones we see not with our eyes, but in our sleep, moments before history catches up to them. Now we journey from the deeply personal realm of dreams to a story that is almost surreal in its physical and historical impact, a catastrophe that was both tragically real and powerfully symbolic. It's a tale of a sugary substance turned into a deadly wave, and how its timing created a bizarre and poignant link to one of America's most radical social experiments, Prohibition. This is the story of the Great Boston Molasses Flood of 1919, a disaster that feels like a dark, sticky metaphor for an era coming to a crashing end. The scene was Boston's North End on January 15th, an unusually warm winter day. The neighborhood was a bustling mix of immigrants, children playing, and workers, all nestled in the shadow of a massive industrial tank owned by the Purity Distilling Company. This tank, 50 feet tall and 90 feet in diameter, held over 2.3 million gallons of molasses, a thick, sweet syrup used primarily for fermenting into industrial alcohol. At around 12:30 in the afternoon, without any warning, the tank gave way. The sound was described as a deep, rolling thunder, followed by the terrifying metallic scream of rivets popping from steel plates. Then came the wave. It was not a slow ooze as one might imagine with molasses. The force of the collapse unleashed a tsunami of syrup, estimated to be between 15 and 40 feet high, moving at an incredible 35 miles per hour. This wall of viscous liquid demolished everything in its path. It swept a freight train off its tracks, crushed buildings, and engulfed the firehouse, trapping firefighters inside. People and animals were caught in the suffocating tide, a struggle made more horrific by the substance's nature. It was impossible to swim in, and it hardened quickly in the January air, trapping victims where they fell. In the end, 21 people were killed and another 150 were injured, many critically. The clean-up took weeks, with salt water from the harbor being used to wash the sticky residue away, and the smell of molasses lingered over Boston for decades. The immediate cause of the disaster was shoddy construction and corporate negligence. The tank had been built hastily and poorly, its walls too thin to safely hold the immense volume it was filled with. Residents had reported leaks since its construction, often collecting the seepage for their homes, but the company had done little more than paint the tank brown to disguise the constant stains. A subsequent court case found the United States Industrial Alcohol Company, Purity's parent company, ultimately responsible, awarding significant damages to the victims' families in one of the first major class action lawsuits in Massachusetts history. It was a landmark case for corporate accountability, but the true, profound coincidence lies in the purpose of that molasses and the timing of the flood. The tank was full because the company was racing to produce as much industrial alcohol as possible. The 18th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which would establish prohibition and ban the manufacture, sale, and transport of alcoholic beverages, was on the verge of being ratified. It would be certified just 8 days after the flood on January 16th and go into effect 1 year later. While the molasses in that tank was destined for industrial uses like munitions and rum flavoring, not drinkable alcohol, the industry as a whole was in a frantic rush. Distilleries were processing every last ounce of fermentable material they could get their hands on before the constitutional door slammed shut forever. In this light, the Boston molasses flood becomes far more than a bizarre industrial accident. it transforms into a grotesque and unintended symbol of the end of an era. The colossal tank, bursting at its poorly made seams, can be seen as a representation of the entire alcohol industry under immense, unsustainable pressure. The wave of molasses that swept through a working-class neighborhood was a literal and figurative flood of the very substance that fueled a major part of that industry. It was as if the city was being punished by the physical manifestation of the economic and social forces that were about to be locked away by law. The tragedy offers a starkly ironic counterpoint to the lofty ideals of the Prohibition movement. Advocates for the ban on alcohol promised a more moral, productive, and healthy society, free from the ravages of drink. Yet here was one of the industry's raw materials claiming lives and causing devastation in a way no saloon or bottle of rum ever could. It was a grim reminder that the pursuit of one kind of control could unleash a completely unexpected form of chaos. The flood was a tragedy of progress and neglect, a moment where the machinery of commerce literally ruptured and spilled into the streets, harming the very people that prohibitionists claimed they wanted to protect. The story of the molasses flood endures because it operates on so many levels. It is a gripping human tragedy, a landmark legal case, a cautionary tale about industrial oversight, and a deeply symbolic historical bookmark. The coincidence of its occurrence on the very doorstep of prohibition elevates it from a strange footnote to a powerful allegory. It captures the messy, uncontrollable, and often violent transition between one age and the next, reminding us that history doesn't always turn a clean page. Sometimes it bursts forth in a torrent, leaving a sticky, sorrowful residue that lasts for generations. From the bizarre and symbolic tragedy of the Boston molasses flood, we travel back nearly 2 millennia to another infamous catastrophe shrouded in rumor, prophecy, and lasting infamy, the Great Fire of Rome. This event, which ravaged the ancient city in 64 AD, is permanently welded to the image of the Emperor Nero, who is said to have famously fiddled while his capital burned. While the fiddle itself is a historical anachronism, the instrument wouldn't be invented for over 1,000 years. The core of the story has persisted, creating a powerful and damning coincidence that suggests foreknowledge, malevolent intent, and a chilling fulfillment of an ancient prophecy. The fire broke out in the merchant shops around Rome's Circus Maximus on the night of July 18th. Fanned by strong winds, it raged uncontrollably for 6 days and 7 nights, consuming 3 of the city's 14 districts completely and leaving 7 others severely damaged. Countless temples, homes, and public buildings were reduced to ash, and thousands of citizens were left homeless and destitute. The ancient historian Tacitus, who was a child at the time, provides our most reliable account, describing a city in chaos with people running through the streets, the sick and elderly being trampled, and looters taking advantage of the panic. The human cost was immense, and the psychological blow to the heart of the empire was even greater. In the smoldering aftermath, the Roman people demanded answers and a scapegoat. The Emperor Nero, who had been away at his villa in Antium when the fire started, quickly returned to organize relief efforts. He opened his gardens to shelter the homeless, arranged for food supplies to be brought in from neighboring towns, and developed a new, ambitious rebuilding plan with wider streets and fire-resistant brick construction. But these practical measures were not enough to quell the growing whispers. Rumors began to circulate that the emperor himself had ordered the fire set. Some accounts, including that of the later historian Suetonius, claimed that Nero had watched the blaze from the Tower of Maecenas, enthralled by what he called the beauty of the flames, and even sung a song about the fall of Troy, comparing the real-time destruction of his own city to a legendary disaster. The most persistent and damning rumor, however, was that Nero had the fire started to clear land for his grandiose new palace complex, the Domus Aurea, or Golden House. This sprawling estate, with its vast parks, artificial lake, and opulently decorated rooms, was indeed built on land cleared by the fire, giving the accusation a compelling, circumstantial weight. Facing a furious populace, Nero needed a diversion. He found one in a small, misunderstood sect known as Christians. He publicly blamed them for the disaster, subjecting them to horrifically creative executions, being burned as human torches to illuminate his gardens or torn apart by wild beasts in the arena. This brutal persecution was a masterstroke of political misdirection, shifting the public's rage from the emperor onto a vulnerable minority. Now, this is where the coincidence deepens beyond mere rumor and into the realm of prophecy. For generations, the Roman state had safeguarded a collection of ancient oracular texts known as the Sibylline books. These were consulted only in times of extreme crisis, and they were said to contain a prophecy that Rome would be destroyed by fire. According to several historical sources, Nero had allegedly been aware of this prophecy. Some accounts even suggest he interpreted it not as a warning to be heeded, but as a destiny to be fulfilled, a divine mandate to be the instrument of the city's destruction so that he could rebuild it in his own glorious image. Whether Nero actually believed this or whether the story was invented by his enemies after the fact is a matter of intense historical debate. His reign was ultimately brought down by rebellion, and the historians who documented it, namely Tacitus and Suetonius, wrote under subsequent dynasties that had a vested interest in painting the last of the Julio-Claudian emperors as a monstrous tyrant. The story of him singing while Rome burned perfectly served that purpose, creating an unforgettable image of decadent, psychotic indifference. The coincidence of the fire's timing, the prophecy's existence, and the construction of his lavish new palace on the ashes was simply too potent a narrative to resist. It cemented his reputation for all time. This intertwining of event, rumor, and prophecy showcases how a historical coincidence can be weaponized to shape a legacy. The truth of what happened that July night is likely lost to time. Perhaps it was a simple accident magnified by the emperor's poor political instincts and the people's need for a villain. Or perhaps Nero, a man who saw himself as a great artist and visionary, did indeed see the Sibylline prophecy as a call to action, making the terrible decision to destroy in order to create on a grander scale. We may never know for certain, but the enduring power of the story lies in this perfect storm of factors: a catastrophic fire, a widely known prophecy, and an emperor whose actions, whether guilty or merely guilty of poor judgment, fit the legend all too well. It remains a timeless lesson in how easily fact can be consumed by a narrative, especially one that offers a chilling and coincidental explanation for the inexplicable. For a figure as colossal as Julius Caesar, it seems only fitting that his death would be accompanied by signs and portents that would echo for millennia. We've already seen how Abraham Lincoln was haunted by a dream of his own assassination, but the story of Caesar's death is woven with an even more public and chillingly specific warning, one that has made the phrase, "Beware the Ides of March," a permanent part of our cultural lexicon for impending doom. This coincidence isn't just about a prediction coming true. It's about how a single date became forever stained by the actions of a group of men who believed they were saving a republic. The Ides itself was simply a date on the Roman calendar, marking the approximate middle of the month. In March, May, July, and October, it fell on the 15th. In every other month, it was the 13th. It was a day for settling debts and making offerings to the god Jupiter. There was nothing inherently sinister about it. What transformed it into an omen was the interaction between Caesar and a seer, a soothsayer, in the weeks leading up to it. The most famous account comes from Plutarch, who writes that the seer, named Spurina, warned Caesar that harm would come to him no later than the Ides of March. Caesar, a man of action and ambition, reportedly dismissed the warning, even joking about it when he passed the seer on his way to the theater of Pompey on that very day, remarking that the Ides had come and he was still fine. To which Spurina allegedly replied, "Aye, Caesar, but they are not gone." The power of this story lies in its dramatic irony. We, the audience of history, know the ending. We know that as Caesar made his way to the Senate meeting that day, a group of 60 senators, led by Marcus Brutus and Gaius Cassius, were waiting for him with daggers concealed beneath their togas. The assassination itself was a brutal, chaotic affair. Caesar was surrounded and stabbed 23 times. The final blow, according to legend, came from his protege Brutus, prompting his famous heartbroken line, "You too, my child." Whether he actually said this or it was a later invention by historians like Suetonius, it cemented the act not just as a political murder, but as the ultimate betrayal. To understand why the conspirators would commit such a drastic act, we must look at the political climate of the late Roman Republic. Caesar had just been named dictator for life, a title that effectively rendered the Senate obsolete and sounded the death knell for the centuries-old republican system. The conspirators, who called themselves the Liberators, genuinely believed they were acting to restore the power of the Senate and save the Republic from the tyranny of a single man. They saw themselves as noble patriots, following in the footsteps of the founders who had overthrown the kings of Rome centuries before. In their minds, they were not murderers, they were executing a tyrant for the greater good of the state. Yet, the most profound coincidence of all is that their noble act achieved the exact opposite of their intentions. Instead of saving the Republic, the assassination of Caesar plunged Rome into a series of civil wars that would ultimately destroy the very system the liberators sought to preserve. The power vacuum left by Caesar's death was filled by his grandnephew and adopted son Octavian, who would later become Caesar Augustus, the first true emperor of Rome. The Republic was dead and the Empire was born. The senators' daggers, wielded in the name of liberty, instead ushered in the very autocratic rule they feared, making the assassination one of history's most tragic and ironic miscalculations. The story of the Ides of March has resonated for over 2,000 years because it's a perfect storm of human drama. It has the compelling elements of a Shakespearean tragedy: hubris, betrayal, fate, and the futility of trying to outrun a prophesied destiny. William Shakespeare himself immortalized the tale in his play Julius Caesar, forever cementing the soothsayer's warning and Brutus's internal conflict in the Western imagination. The date itself has taken on a supernatural weight. Even today, when something bad happens around March 15th, people will half-jokingly reference the Ides, a testament to the enduring power of this ancient story. Ultimately, the coincidence of the warning and the assassination forces us to grapple with a difficult question. Was Spurinna's prophecy a genuine glimpse of the future, or was it an educated guess from a man who could read the dangerous political currents swirling around Caesar? In a city filled with rumors of plots and discontent, a soothsayer offering a general warning of danger was essentially a safe bet. The true coincidence may not be that he predicted danger, but that the conspirators chose that specific prophesied date to act, thereby ensuring that the warning would be remembered not as a vague threat, but as a precise and terrifying prediction. It is a story where human ambition, political ideology, and a sprinkle of superstition collided on a single calendar date, creating a coincidence so powerful that it forever changed how we think about fate, power, and the unexpected consequences of our actions. Sometimes the most profound discoveries are not made in the quiet halls of academia, but in the chaotic, dust-choked trenches of war. Such was the case with one of the most important archaeological finds in human history, an event that perfectly illustrates how a single moment of serendipity can unlock centuries of mystery. The year was 1799, and Napoleon Bonaparte's ambitious campaign in Egypt was in full swing. His goal was not just military conquest, but also a scholarly one. He had brought with him a corps of 167 scientists, engineers, and artists, the savants, to document and study the ancient land. It was a grand fusion of empire and enlightenment, and it was within this volatile context that a group of French soldiers, under the command of Lieutenant Pierre-François Bouchard, were ordered to repair an old Ottoman fort near the town of Rashid, which Europeans called Rosetta. As the soldiers tore down a crumbling wall to reuse its stones for their fortifications, their pickaxes struck something far more substantial than rubble. It was a dark slab of granodiorite about the size of a large coffee table, and its surface was covered in writing. Lieutenant Bouchard, recognizing this was no ordinary rock, immediately halted the work. He saw that the stone was inscribed with 3 distinct scripts. At the top were the elegant pictorial symbols of ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. In the middle was a cursive script they would later learn was Demotic, a common language of ancient Egypt, and at the bottom was ancient Greek. Bouchard, understanding the potential significance, reported the find to the scholars traveling with the army. In that single, unplanned moment, a group of soldiers building a fort had stumbled upon the key to a language lost to the world for nearly 1,500 years. The sheer improbability of this discovery is staggering. For centuries, scholars had been utterly baffled by hieroglyphs. They were surrounded by these beautiful, enigmatic symbols covering obelisks, temple walls, and papyrus scrolls, but their meaning was a complete cipher. Many believed they were not a true language at all, but a form of mystical picture writing, with each symbol representing a complex idea rather than a sound. Without a bilingual text, a sort of decoder ring, the chances of ever cracking the code were virtually zero. The Rosetta Stone was that very key, arriving at the precise moment when European scholarship was poised and eager to receive it. The savants of Napoleon's expedition were electrified. They immediately made copies and casts of the inscriptions, sending them to academies across Europe. The race to decipher hieroglyphs had officially begun, but the story of the stone is also a story of war and its strange role as an agent of historical chance. The stone's discovery was a direct result of Napoleon's military campaign, yet its journey was not over. In 1801, French forces in Egypt were defeated by the British. As part of the terms of surrender, the French were compelled to hand over all the antiquities they had collected, including the Rosetta Stone. It was shipped to England, where it was presented to King George III, who in turn donated it to the British Museum, its home to this day. This transfer created a fascinating irony. A stone discovered by the French, which became the foundation of Egyptology, would reside in an English museum. Yet, this twist of fate may have accelerated its study, as it placed the stone at the heart of a vibrant intellectual community where scholars from many nations could access it. The actual process of decipherment was a monumental intellectual puzzle, a race between brilliant minds across Europe. The initial breakthrough came from an English physicist named Thomas Young, who deduced that the Demotic script was not purely alphabetic but a mixture of sound signs and idea signs. But the ultimate victory belongs to the French philologist Jean-François Champollion. Using the Greek text as his guide and with a profound knowledge of the Coptic language, a later form of ancient Egyptian Champollion proved in 1822 that hieroglyphs were a complex system that combined phonetic characters with logographic ones. He could finally read the names of pharaohs carved in cartouches, and from there, the entire language unfolded. The ancient Egyptians, silent for millennia, could finally speak again. The impact of this decipherment cannot be overstated. It was nothing less than a revolution. The Rosetta Stone did not just unlock a language, it flung open the doors to 3,000 years of human history. Suddenly, every inscription on every tomb, temple, and monument could be read. The daily lives, religious beliefs, political systems, and grand histories of one of the world's greatest civilizations were revealed in breathtaking detail. Egyptology was born as a modern science, moving from speculation and myth into the realm of evidence-based understanding. It allowed us to meet pharaohs like Ramesses the Great and learn about the reign of Cleopatra from Egyptian sources, not just Greek and Roman historians. The Rosetta Stone's legacy extends far beyond academia. Its name has become a universal metaphor for any crucial key to unlocking a previously indecipherable mystery, used in fields from genetics and cryptography to computer programming. It stands as a powerful testament to the role of pure, random chance in the advancement of human knowledge. A soldier's pickaxe swung not in pursuit of glory, but in the mundane task of building a wall, struck a stone that would illuminate the dark corners of the ancient world. It reminds us that history's greatest discoveries often come not from a deliberate search, but from being in the right place at the right time, with the right mind to recognize a miracle hiding in plain sight. But what if the coincidences that bind us are not written in the stars or in the pages of history, but are instead encoded in our very DNA, waiting for the right moment to reveal a connection so profound it defies all logic? This brings us to one of the most famous and meticulously documented cases of synchronicity ever studied, a story that forever changed our understanding of nature versus nurture and turned two separated brothers into a scientific sensation. It's the story of the Jim twins, Jim Lewis and Jim Springer, a pair of identical twins who were separated just weeks after their birth in 1940 and adopted by two different families in Ohio. They grew up completely unaware of each other's existence, living separate lives just 45 miles apart. It wasn't until they were 39 years old that Jim Lewis, driven by a growing curiosity about his origins, decided to track down his biological brother. When he finally made the call to Jim Springer, the conversation that followed was so shocking that it left both men utterly speechless. They quickly discovered that their lives weren't just similar, they were nearly perfect mirrors of one another. The first stunning revelation was that they had both named their first-born son James Allen, but the coincidences didn't stop with their children. They discovered that each had been married twice, first to a woman named Linda and then to a woman named Betty. Their career path showed an uncanny alignment as well. Both had worked part-time in law enforcement. One had been a security guard, the other a deputy sheriff. They shared remarkably specific hobbies, including woodworking and mechanical drawing. They both drove the same model and color of car, a Chevrolet, and they even vacationed at the same small beach in Florida. Perhaps one of the most delightfully bizarre details was that they both owned a dog named Toy. The sheer volume of these parallels, from the deeply significant to the whimsically trivial, was simply beyond anything that could be easily explained by random chance. When news of their reunion broke, it sent ripples through the scientific community, particularly among psychologists and geneticists. The case was quickly picked up by the Minnesota Center for Twin and Family Research, led by Dr. Thomas Bouchard, who began an intensive study of the twins. For researchers, the Jim twins represented a near-perfect natural experiment. Because they were identical twins, they shared 100% of their genes. But because they were raised in separate environments, any similarities in their personalities, preferences, and life choices could be more strongly attributed to genetics than to upbringing. The twins underwent days of testing, from IQ tests and personality assessments to detailed interviews about their life histories. The findings were groundbreaking. The study of the Jim twins and other separated identical twins that followed provided some of the most compelling evidence for the heritability of certain traits. It suggested that our genetic blueprint might influence far more than just our physical appearance or predisposition to disease. It might gently nudge us towards certain careers, hobbies, and even relationship patterns. The case became a cornerstone in the nature versus nurture debate, demonstrating that the two are not opposing forces but are intricately intertwined, with genetics playing a far more significant role in shaping our personalities than previously believed. For the general public, however, the science was almost secondary to the poetry of the story. The idea that two brothers, separated for decades, could live such eerily parallel lives spoke to a deep, almost mystical human desire for connection and destiny. It wasn't just that they both liked woodworking, it was that they had both chosen to name their dogs Toy. This level of specificity felt less like a genetic predisposition and more like a shared soul. The story was featured in newspapers, magazines, and television shows around the world, captivating millions who saw it as undeniable proof that some connections are simply meant to be. Skeptics, of course, offer alternative explanations. They point to the concept of confirmation bias, the tendency to focus on the many striking similarities while ignoring the numerous differences that certainly must have existed. They also note that the twins were raised in the same state, in the same era, within the same broader culture, which would naturally lead to some shared experiences and naming trends. Linda and James were extremely popular names in the 1960s and 70s. Yet, even when accounting for these factors, the cumulative weight of the coincidences remains staggering, a statistical outlier that continues to fascinate and perplex. The legacy of the Jim twins is a powerful dual one. In the world of science, they provided invaluable data that advanced our understanding of behavioral genetics, helping to shift the academic consensus on how deeply our genes influence who we are. In the world of storytelling and human experience, they remain a timeless anecdote, a go-to example when we speak of the unexplainable bonds that seem to transcend time, distance, and circumstance. Their story is a beautiful reminder that sometimes the most compelling evidence for life's mysteries isn't found in a laboratory, but in the shared, inexplicable details of two lives lived in unison, even when they were worlds apart. Yet, even as the Jim twins revealed connections written in our genes, our next story takes us to a place where human history and the natural world collided in a perfect storm of tragedy, duty, and horrific coincidence. A story that stands as one of the most harrowing survival ordeals of the 20th century, forever linked to the dawn of the atomic age. This is the story of the USS Indianapolis, a U.S. Navy cruiser that completed a top-secret mission of world-altering importance, only to meet a fate so gruesome it would become the worst naval disaster in American history, made infinitely more terrifying by the predators lurking in the depths below. In late July 1945, the Indianapolis steamed across the Pacific at top speed. Its mission was one of the best-kept secrets of the war, to deliver the crucial internal components, an enriched uranium core of the atomic bomb nicknamed Little Boy, from San Francisco to the American Air Base on Tinian Island. The ship's captain, Charles McVeigh, was told the contents of the boxes were so vital that the fate of the war could depend on their swift and safe delivery. The Indianapolis succeeded, arriving at Tinian on July 26th and offloading its deadly cargo without incident. From there, Captain McVeigh was given new orders to sail to the Philippines for training before joining the planned invasion of Japan. The ship was traveling unescorted, a decision based on naval intelligence that deemed the route to be of minimal threat from enemy submarines. This assessment was tragically wrong. Just after midnight on July 30th, the Indianapolis was struck by two torpedoes from the Japanese submarine I-58. The ship, hit in the bow and near midship, immediately took on a heavy list and sank in a mere 12 minutes. Of the nearly 1,200 men on board, approximately 300 went down with the ship. The remaining 900 were thrown into the pitch-black, oil-slicked waters of the Philippine Sea, many without lifeboats or adequate survival equipment. In the chaos and darkness, the Navy had no idea the Indianapolis was missing. The ship had not been required to send a routine position report, and the frantic, garbled distress calls sent as she sank were either not received or not believed. The men were alone, adrift in one of the most shark-infested stretches of ocean on the planet. The days that followed were an unimaginable descent into hell. The survivors faced dehydration, hypothermia, saltwater poisoning, and delirium. But their most persistent and terrifying tormentors were the ocean's most efficient hunters, oceanic white-tip sharks. Drawn by the thrashing, the blood from wounded sailors, and the sheer mass of bodies, the sharks began their attacks at dawn on the first day. They would circle the groups of men and with horrifying frequency would suddenly dart in to drag a sailor under. The survivors could only watch in terror, helpless to defend themselves. The attacks created a vicious cycle, each victim's death would attract more sharks, fueling a frenzy that lasted for days. Men would huddle together, kicking and screaming to ward them off, only to see their comrades picked off one by one. The psychological toll was as devastating as the physical one. The historical irony of this situation is almost too profound to grasp. These men had just delivered the instrument that would ultimately end the war, a bomb of such immense destructive power it would force Japan's surrender and save an estimated 1 million Allied lives that would have been lost in a ground invasion. Yet, after successfully completing this monumental, war-winning mission, they were left to suffer and die in the most primal, agonizing way imaginable, victims of a weapon from the ancient natural world. They were casualties of a war they had just helped to finish, a cruel and bitter coincidence that adds a layer of deep tragedy to their sacrifice. Their ordeal finally ended 4.5 days later on August 2nd, only by pure chance. A Navy patrol plane on a routine flight happened to spot a large oil slick and upon investigation saw men scattered across the waves. The rescue operation that followed was the largest in U.S. Navy history. When it was over, only 317 men were pulled from the water alive. The rest had perished from exposure, drowning, dehydration, or shark attacks. The sinking of the Indianapolis and the subsequent court-martial of Captain McVeigh, unjustly blamed for the disaster, became a lasting scar on the Navy's conscience, a story of bureaucratic failure and unimaginable horror. In the decades since, the event has taken on a powerful symbolic meaning. It represents the brutal indifference of nature when thrust into the affairs of humankind, a stark reminder that technological triumph does not confer immunity from primordial danger. The sharks were not agents of the enemy, they were simply predators acting on instinct, their presence a horrific coincidence of geography and circumstance. The story of the Indianapolis is now permanently woven into the fabric of World War II history, not just as a tragic footnote, but as a powerful, sobering allegory for the unpredictable and often cruel intersection of human ambition, the machinery of war, and the unforgiving power of the natural world. If the story of the Indianapolis shows how a single event can shatter lives through a cruel twist of fate, our next coincidence reveals how a single year can shatter the entire world, setting civilization on a darker path for generations. Historians and archaeologists have long debated the concept of a worst year in human history, and while there are many terrible contenders, the year 536 consistently emerges as the undisputed champion of catastrophe. This wasn't a year of one localized disaster, but a terrifyingly precise alignment of multiple global calamities, a cascade of misery that began with a mysterious fog and plunged continents into a darkness that would last for more than a century. It began with the sun. In the spring of 536, people across Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia looked up to see something utterly terrifying. The sun began to dim, not like during an eclipse, but as if its very power was fading. The Byzantine historian Procopius wrote that the sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon all day long. A persistent, dusty haze settled over the landscape, blocking solar warmth and casting the world into a perpetual, gloomy twilight. This was not a local weather event. Reports from Ireland to China describe the same phenomenon. Temperatures plummeted, snow fell in summer in places like China, and the cold simply refused to lift. The cause we now know from ice core samples drilled from glaciers in Greenland and Antarctica was a cataclysmic volcanic eruption of staggering proportions, most likely in Iceland or North America. The immediate consequences were devastating. The global volcanic winter caused by this atmospheric veil of sulfuric acid droplets annihilated agriculture. Crops failed utterly from Ireland to Mesopotamia to China. The summer of 536 provided no summer at all. This was followed by widespread famine as grain stores were depleted and nothing new grew. The Irish chronicles record a failure of bread from 536 to 539. In China, reports tell of widespread starvation and snow in August. The famine was so severe that it broke social order. Procopius reports that in Byzantium, people were selling their children for food and engaging in cannibalism just to survive. A society's entire structure can collapse when the basic contract of a harvest is broken. Then, as populations were weakened by hunger and cold, the final blow landed. In 541, the bubonic plague arrived at the Egyptian port of Pelusium. This was the beginning of the Justinianic plague, named after the Byzantine Emperor Justinian, who himself would contract the disease but survive. The plague bacterium Yersinia pestis found a perfect landscape for devastation. A massive, interconnected trade network within the Byzantine Empire and a huge population of humans and rats whose immune systems were critically weakened by years of malnutrition. The plague spread with terrifying speed, wiping out perhaps a third to half of the population of the Mediterranean world. It was a mortality rate that would not be seen again until the Black Death 800 years later. The true coincidence, the concentrated pattern that makes this year so pivotal, is not just that these events happened, but that they happened in such a brutally efficient sequence. The volcanic winter of 536 didn't just cause a single bad year, it triggered a feedback loop of despair. The famine it caused weakened the population, making them susceptible to disease. The plague that followed a few years later then killed off so many people that there were not enough farmers to tend the fields or soldiers to man the empires, which prolonged the economic collapse and deepened the darkness. It was a 1-2-3 punch from which the ancient world could not recover. This convergence of disasters fundamentally changed the course of history, acting as a violent accelerator into what we now call the Dark Ages. The Roman Empire under Justinian had been in the midst of a magnificent reconquest, having retaken large parts of Italy and North Africa. The plague decimated his armies and emptied his treasury, ending forever the dream of reuniting the Roman Empire. In Europe, the drastic population decline and economic collapse fragmented political power, strengthening the local rule of feudal lords and weakening central authorities. Trade networks that had stretched across the known world shriveled up. Cultural and scientific progress largely ground to a halt as societies focused purely on survival. The long, stagnant period that followed can be directly traced back to the climatic catastrophe of 536. What makes this event so hauntingly strange is its global scale and pinpoint timing. Civilizations from the Byzantine Empire to the Sasanian Empire in Persia, to the dynasties in China and the kingdoms in Europe all recorded the same strange weather and suffered the same terrible consequences, all completely unaware of each other's plight. They all experienced it as their own local apocalypse, not understanding they were all victims of a single planetary event. This wasn't a war or a decision made by kings. It was a geological accident that altered human destiny more than any army ever could. The year 536 stands as a stark reminder of humanity's profound vulnerability to the forces of nature and how the most pivotal turning points in our history can be triggered not by human ambition, but by the ash from a single anonymous volcano. If the year 536 shows how a single volcanic event could trigger a cascade of global suffering, our next coincidence reveals how two separate, colossal catastrophes can converge, feeding off each other's devastation in a deadly partnership that reshaped an entire continent. This is the story of the Great Famine of 1315 and the Black Death, two of the most infamous chapters in human history, whose timing was so brutally coincidental that it forever shattered medieval Europe's understanding of the world and its place within it. We begin not with plague but with rain, an enormous amount of it. Starting in the spring of 1315, Europe was subjected to a seemingly endless deluge. Chronicles from England to Poland describe a world drowning under cold, torrential rains that simply refused to stop. The summers were a washout and the winters were brutally cold. This was no ordinary bad weather. Modern paleoclimatology points to a massive volcanic event, likely in the tropics or New Zealand, that pumped vast quantities of aerosols into the atmosphere, blocking sunlight and destabilizing weather patterns for years. The result was a complete agricultural collapse. Grain crops like wheat and barley rotted in the waterlogged fields. The constant moisture caused outbreaks of ergot fungus, a poison that could cause convulsions and hallucinations in those who ate contaminated bread. Hay couldn't be dried to feed livestock, so farmers were forced to slaughter their oxen and plow horses, crippling their ability to work the land for seasons to come. This was the Great Famine, and it lasted for a grueling 2 years, with its effects lingering even longer. The social contract of the medieval world, built on the promise of a harvest, completely broke down. Food prices skyrocketed to levels previously unimaginable. Peasants, who made up the vast majority of the population, sold their land, their tools, and even their children for a scrap of food. Reports of mass graves, cannibalism, and people dying in the streets filled the chronicles of the time. The famine did not kill through a single, swift blow, but through a slow, grinding process of malnutrition and disease. It created a population that was physically weakened, desperate, and ripe for the next, even greater catastrophe. That catastrophe arrived just a generation later, in 1347. The Black Death, the deadliest pandemic in human history, swept out of Central Asia and into Europe via trade routes like the Silk Road. Carried by fleas living on black rats, the Yersinia pestis bacterium proved to be a pathogen of almost unimaginable efficiency. It manifested in 3 forms: the bubonic plague with its characteristic swollen and blackened lymph nodes, the septicemic plague which infected the blood, and the pneumonic plague which attacked the lungs and could be spread through the air from person to person. Mortality rates were staggering, wiping out between 30% and 60% of Europe's entire population in a matter of a few horrific years. The connection between the famine and the plague is where we find our powerful and tragic historical coincidence. They were not directly causally linked. The bacterium didn't emerge because of the famine, but their timing created a deadly synergy that maximized the devastation. The famine had already created a massive population of severely malnourished and immunocompromised people. Their bodies, weakened by years of starvation, had no resistance to fight off the virulent disease. Furthermore, the social dislocation caused by the famine played a role in the plague's spread. Desperate people had abandoned their villages and flooded into cities in search of food, creating densely packed, squalid, and unsanitary urban environments that were the perfect breeding ground for the rats and fleas that carried the plague. The psychological and societal impact of this one-two punch was profound and lasting. Medieval society had no scientific understanding of germ theory or climate science. They searched for a reason for such immense, undeserved suffering. Many saw it as the wrath of God, a divine punishment for humanity's sins. This led to the rise of extremism, most notably the flagellant movements, where groups of people would publicly whip themselves in a desperate attempt to atone for the sins they believed had brought on the plague. Others searched for more earthly scapegoats, leading to violent pogroms against Jewish communities who were falsely accused of poisoning wells. The absolute scale of death also shattered the feudal system. With so many laborers dead, those who survived found their labor was suddenly in high demand. They could demand higher wages and better conditions, beginning to break down the rigid social hierarchies that had defined the Middle Ages. From a broader historical perspective, the convergence of the Great Famine and the Black Death represents a perfect storm of Malthusian theory in action. Before the calamities, Europe's population had been growing steadily, pushing against the limits of its agricultural capacity. The famine was a classic Malthusian check, a crisis caused by population outstripping resources. The plague then acted as a horrific secondary check, collapsing the population down to a level the land could once again sustain. This dual catastrophe essentially hit the reset button on medieval Europe, clearing the way for the social, economic, and cultural transformations that would eventually lead to the Renaissance. It was a period of unimaginable darkness, but from its ashes emerged a new world, forever marked by the coincidental timing of rain, rats, and a microscopic killer that found a continent already on its knees. But if the great plagues and famines showed the devastating power of real pathogens, our next story takes us to a far more mysterious and psychologically haunting phenomenon, one where the illness wasn't spread by rats or contaminated grain, but seemingly by sight and suggestion alone, creating a physical manifestation of collective despair. In the sweltering summer of 1518, in the city of Strasbourg, a woman named Frau Trophia stepped into the street and began to dance. This was not a dance of joy or celebration. It was a frantic, compulsive, and utterly uncontrollable motion. She danced alone for days, her feet bleeding, her body exhausted, yet she could not stop. Within a week, the city that had watched her with curiosity and then alarm found itself in the grip of a full-blown epidemic. Dozens, then hundreds of its citizens joined her in this maniacal, ceaseless dance. They twirled and jerked in the public squares and on the cobbled streets, their faces often etched with terror and agony, dancing until they collapsed from heart attacks, strokes, or sheer exhaustion. By the time the plague subsided weeks later, as many as 400 people had been affected, and official death tolls record at least 15 people literally danced themselves to death. To understand the sheer strangeness of this event, we must view it through the lens of its time. The 16th century was an era deeply superstitious and attuned to the concept of divine punishment. The initial reaction of the city's authorities was to assume the dancers were afflicted by a curse, perhaps a demonic possession or the wrath of a saint, most commonly Saint Vitus, who was associated with a nervous disorder called chorea. Following the logic of the day, the city council decided that the cure for this demonic dancing was more dancing. They literally prescribed it. They cleared 2 guild halls, hired musicians and professional dancers, and even built a wooden stage, believing that if the afflicted could just dance the demon out of their system, they would be cured. This decision, of course, had the opposite effect. The constant music and the sight of others dancing only exacerbated the mania, pulling more susceptible onlookers into the frenzied fray. But the true coincidence, the key to unlocking this mystery, lies not in the supernatural, but in the profound and desperate social conditions that gripped Strasbourg in the years leading up to the summer of 1518. The region had been devastated by a series of brutal harvest failures, leading to extreme famine and skyrocketing food prices. This was compounded by the political and social instability that often follows such material collapse. The city was flooded with desperate refugees from the countryside, all competing for scarce resources. To make matters even worse, a wave of terrifying new diseases, most likely syphilis and smallpox, was sweeping through the population. The people of Strasbourg were living in a state of constant, grinding anxiety, fear, and hopelessness, a perfect psychological tinderbox waiting for a spark. Modern scholars looking back at the dancing plague see not a supernatural event, but a powerful and tragic example of what we now call mass psychogenic illness or mass hysteria. This is a phenomenon where psychological distress manifests as physical symptoms in a large group of people. It typically occurs in communities under extreme, shared stress, where there is no clear outlet for fear or protest. The body, unable to process the overwhelming psychological pressure, finds a physical release valve. In medieval Strasbourg, dance became that valve. The initial dancer, Frau Trophia, may have been suffering from a personal psychotic break or a stress-induced seizure disorder, but her very public display provided a template. For others in the crowd, already teetering on the edge of breakdown from famine and disease, her frenzied movements became a contagious somatic script, a way for their collective anguish to literally move through them and become visible to the world. The dancing plague stands as one of history's most extreme and literal examples of the body keeping the score of societal trauma. These people weren't choosing to dance. Their bodies were acting out a distress that their minds could no longer contain. The coincidence of this bizarre event occurring precisely during a period of such intense shared suffering is what moves it from a mere oddity into a profound historical lesson. It reveals the very real physical power of the human psyche when pushed to its absolute limit, and serves as a stark reminder that sometimes the most inexplicable events are not caused by curses or demons, but by the unbearable weight of a broken world. Now we venture from the psychological terrors of the dancing plague to a cataclysm of pure physical force, an event that shook the remote Siberian wilderness with the power of 1,000 atomic bombs and left a mystery so profound it would inadvertently entangle one of history's greatest inventors in a web of conspiracy. On the morning of June 30th, 1908, in a largely uninhabited region near the Podkamennaya Tunguska River, a blinding fireball streaked across the sky. It was followed by a series of massive explosions so powerful they registered on seismic stations across Europe and Asia. The shockwave that ripped through the taiga was titanic, flattening an estimated 80 million trees across 800 square miles. The sound was deafening, and the atmospheric disturbance was so intense that for nights afterward, skies across Europe and Asia glowed so brightly that people could read newspapers outdoors at midnight. For decades, the remote location and the political turmoil in Russia prevented thorough investigation, allowing the true cause of the Tunguska event to remain one of the 20th century's most captivating scientific enigmas. It is within this vacuum of certainty that a fascinating and persistent historical coincidence took root. At the very same time this mysterious force was obliterating a vast swath of Siberian forest, the brilliant and famously enigmatic inventor Nikola Tesla was deeply engrossed in his most ambitious project yet. From his laboratory at Wardenclyffe on Long Island, Tesla was attempting to realize his dream of wireless energy transmission. He believed he could send electrical power through the Earth itself without wires to light cities and power industry across the globe. His experiments involved building massive electrical coils, like his giant magnifying transmitter, designed to pump tremendous amounts of electrical energy into the planet's crust. In the months leading up to the Tunguska event, Tesla had been making grandiose claims about the power of his equipment, even boasting to his financial backer, J.P. Morgan, that he could use his technology to send signals to Mars. He had also recorded in his notes a series of powerful, rhythmic earthquakes felt in the New York area that seemed to correlate with the operation of his machine. This temporal overlap was all the fuel that conspiracy theories needed to ignite. The idea was both simple and sensational. Tesla, in a fit of experimental overreach, had accidentally unleashed the awesome power of his Wardenclyffe tower. He had intended to send a harmless burst of energy across the Atlantic as a demonstration, but he miscalculated, and the focused beam of force instead found its target in the Siberian wilderness, detonating with unimaginable violence. Proponents of this theory point to a curious anecdote. They claim that in the days following the explosion, Tesla urgently requested maps of Siberia from the New York Public Library, as if he were checking the coordinates of an errant shot. For those who see patterns where science sees chaos, it was a perfect fit. A larger-than-life inventor, known for his revolutionary and poorly understood experiments, coinciding perfectly with a colossal and unexplained explosion. The scientific consensus, however, offers a far more plausible, if less dramatic, explanation. The evidence gathered by numerous expeditions, most notably Leonid Kulik's in the 1920s and later scientific trips, strongly points to a natural cosmic impact. The pattern of flattened trees radiates outward from a central point, and there is no impact crater because the object likely exploded in the air several miles above the ground. The leading theory is that a stony asteroid or comet, roughly 120 feet in diameter, entered Earth's atmosphere at a speed of over 30,000 miles per hour. The intense heat and pressure of atmospheric entry caused it to vaporize in a massive aerial burst, releasing energy equivalent to 10 to 15 million tons of TNT. This explanation, known as an air burst, accounts for all the observed facts: the lack of a crater, the radial tree fall, and the immense energy release. In fact, the 1994 impact of comet Shoemaker-Levy 9 on Jupiter provided a stunning visual demonstration of how such violent cosmic events work. The enduring appeal of the Tesla theory, despite the overwhelming scientific evidence to the contrary, reveals a deep human tendency. We are often uncomfortable with random, indifferent acts of nature. A sterile explanation like a rogue space rock feels anticlimactic and meaningless, but a story that involves a brilliant, misunderstood genius accidentally shaking the world. That has drama, that has a narrative. It fits our desire for the world to be a place of intention and connection, even if that connection is catastrophic. The Tunguska-Tesla coincidence persists because it transforms a random astronomical event into a chapter in a human story, a cautionary tale about hubris and the untamable power of invention. It is a testament to the shadow Nikola Tesla still casts over our imagination, a figure so ahead of his time that we are still willing to believe he could, even by accident, reach out and touch the far corners of the earth with the force of a god. While the stories of Tesla and Tunguska invite us to look to the skies for explanations, our next coincidence brings our focus back to Earth, to a harbor, a collision, and a cataclysm of human error that delivered a blow of almost biblical proportions. The date was December 6, 1917, and the port of Halifax, Nova Scotia, was a bustling, vital hub in the Allied war effort. As a key assembly point for transatlantic convoys, its harbor was constantly filled with merchant ships, troop transports, and naval escorts, all weaving through the narrows known as the Narrows under a tense wartime pace. On this clear, cold morning, two ships found themselves on a fatal course. The Norwegian vessel SS Warrimoo, a relief ship chartered by the Belgian government, was running late and leaving harbor, heading out to sea. Coming in from the opposite direction was the French cargo ship SS Mont Blanc, arriving to join a convoy. But the Mont Blanc was no ordinary freighter. Its holds were packed to the brim with some of the most volatile explosives known to man, over 2,500 tons of picric acid, TNT, and gunkerton, along with hundreds of drums of highly flammable benzol fuel on its decks. The sequence of errors that followed was a masterclass in tragic miscommunication. As the two ships approached each other in the confined channel, a series of misunderstood whistle signals and hesitant maneuvers caused them to steer directly into one another's path. The Warrimoo struck the Mont Blanc a glancing but devastating blow on its starboard bow. The collision itself was not catastrophic, but the sparks it generated ignited the benzol drums stored on deck. Fire quickly spread across the Mont Blanc, and its terrified crew, knowing the apocalyptic potential of their cargo, immediately abandoned ship, rowing frantically for the Dartmouth shore while shouting warnings to other vessels that their ship was about to explode. Their desperate cries were largely misunderstood or ignored by those on shore, who gathered to watch the burning ship drift toward the pier, unaware they were witnessing a floating bomb. The human element of this story converges in a heartbreaking twist of fate with the tale of Vince Coleman, a railway dispatcher working in the Richmond railway yards, directly adjacent to the pier the burning ship was drifting toward. As the fire raged, a telegraph message was sent to all rail stations warning them to halt incoming trains, as a munitions ship was on fire in the harbor and an explosion was imminent. Coleman and his co-worker initially fled their post, but Coleman, realizing the overnight passenger train from St. John, New Brunswick, carrying hundreds of people, was due to arrive at the station at any moment, made a fateful decision. He turned back to his telegraph key to send one last vital message. His transmission: hold up the train. Ammunition ship afire in harbor making for Pier 6 and will explode. "Guess this will be my last message, goodbye boys," was received just in time to stop the train at a safe distance, saving every soul on board. Minutes later, the Mont Blanc erupted. The explosion that followed was the largest human-made blast in history until the invention of the atomic bomb. The Mont Blanc was virtually vaporized in an instant, unleashing an energy equivalent to roughly 3 kilotons of TNT. A white-hot fireball rose over 2,000 meters into the air, followed by a mushroom cloud. The shockwave ripped through the city at over 1,000 meters per second, obliterating the entire neighborhood of Richmond and leveling most of the north end of Halifax. A tsunami generated by the blast washed high up onto the shore, adding flooding to the devastation. The toll was horrific. Nearly 2,000 people were killed instantly, and another 9,000 were injured, many blinded by flying glass from shattered windows or burned by the subsequent fires that raged through the city. Vince Coleman, along with his co-worker, perished at his post, a hero whose final act of duty saved countless lives even as it cost him his own. The timing of this disaster, deep within the context of the First World War, adds a layer of profound and bitter irony. Halifax was a city dedicated to supporting the fight against destruction in Europe, yet it was ultimately destroyed by the very instruments of that war. The munitions on the Mont Blanc were destined for the battlefields of Europe, intended to cause devastation far from Canadian shores. Instead, they unleashed their fury at home on a civilian population that had already sacrificed so much. The explosion became the single largest mass blinding event in history until that time, as people who had rushed to their windows to see the fire were met with the shattering force of the blast, a cruel twist for a community that had sent so many of its sons to face the horrors of the trenches. In the aftermath, the people of Halifax displayed incredible resilience, and the city became the recipient of one of the first major international relief efforts, most notably from the city of Boston, which sent medical personnel, supplies, and millions of dollars in aid. This generosity forged a bond between the two cities that remains unbroken to this day, with Halifax still sending an annual Christmas tree to Boston in gratitude. The Halifax explosion stands as a stark monument to the law of unintended consequences, a devastating coincidence of a routine harbor maneuver, a ship filled with the concentrated power of war, and the courageous act of one man whose final message ensured that his story and the stories of those he saved would be the lasting legacy of that terrible morning. From the industrial and accidental horrors of Halifax, we journey to a moment of profound ideological and personal tragedy, a story where the threads of fate seem to weave a pattern of devastating symmetry around the life and death of a man who embodied peace. Mahatma Gandhi, the frail lawyer who became the mighty soul of India's independence movement, was assassinated on the evening of January 30th, 1948. He was on his way to a prayer meeting at the Birla House in New Delhi when a young man stepped from the crowd, bowed as if in respect, and then fired 3 shots from a pistol at point-blank range. Gandhi's final words were reported to be, "Hey Ram, O God," a fitting, poignant end for a man whose life was a constant conversation with the divine. His death sent shockwaves around the world, plunging a nation already reeling from the violent birth pangs of independence into a deep, paralyzing grief. The identity of his killer only deepened the national wound. He was Nathuram Godse, a Hindu nationalist and former member of the Mahasabha, a political organization that stood in direct opposition to Gandhi's philosophy. Godse and his co-conspirators were furious with Gandhi for what they saw as his capitulation to Muslim demands during the partition of India. They blamed him personally for the creation of Pakistan and for the subsequent horrific violence that saw millions of Hindus and Muslims displaced and slaughtered. In their twisted logic, Gandhi's persistent calls for peace and unity, his fasts unto death to stop the riots, were not acts of saintly sacrifice but betrayals of the Hindu nation. His assassination was not a random act of violence. It was a calculated political murder designed to silence a vision of India that included all faiths. The historical context of this period cannot be overstated. Indian independence in August 1947 was not the triumphant, unified celebration many had dreamed of. It was accompanied by partition, a hastily drawn border that carved a Muslim-majority Pakistan out of the subcontinent. The result was one of the largest and bloodiest mass migrations in human history. Trains packed with refugees arrived in each new country carrying carriages full of corpses. Entire villages were wiped out in sectarian violence. Gandhi himself walked through the riot-torn areas, trying to quell the madness with his mere presence. In this cauldron of hatred, his message of non-violence and religious tolerance felt to extremists on both sides like a dangerous anachronism. His death felt like the final, terrible victory of that hatred. Now, this is where the coincidence, cold and precise, enters the narrative. After a highly publicized trial, Nathuram Godse was found guilty of murder and sentenced to death. The date set for his execution was November 15, 1949. However, an appeal to the Punjab High Court delayed the carrying out of the sentence. The new date that was ultimately confirmed was January 30, 1950, exactly 2 years to the day after he had extinguished the life of the Mahatma. Nathuram Godse was hanged at Ambala Central Jail. The symmetry is so stark it feels less like a matter of judicial scheduling and more like a dark, poetic closure written by some unseen hand of fate. This alignment of dates is irresistible to the human desire for symbolic meaning. For many of Gandhi's followers, it was a form of divine justice, a karmic balance that saw the perpetrator meet his end on the very anniversary of his great sin. It transformed the date from one of pure mourning into a day of somber reckoning, a reminder that even the act of execution could not truly resolve the deep ideological chasm Gandhi's death represented. The date itself seems to hold a grim weight, forever linking the martyr and his murderer in a cycle of violence that, despite Gandhi's lifelong mission, ultimately claimed them both. Skeptics, of course, would argue that the date was a simple bureaucratic coincidence, a procedural outcome devoid of deeper meaning. But even if we accept that, the power of the symbol remains. Dates in history often become anchors for collective memory. We remember where we were on specific days because those dates become containers for immense emotion and significance. January 30th became such a date for India, a day that marks both the loss of its greatest apostle of peace and 2 years later, the cold, legal end of the hatred that killed him. It serves as an annual, somber meditation on the very nature of the Indian experiment, a constant, often painful tension between the forces of pluralistic tolerance and the pull of violent nationalism. The story of Gandhi and Godse is more than a strange twist of the calendar. It is a permanent allegory. Gandhi's life was a testament to the idea that the universe is ultimately structured by moral law, by what he called satyagraha or truth force. Godse's act was an assertion that raw political power and ethnic identity are the true engines of history. That their stories concluded on the same calendar date creates a profound and unsettling coincidence. It suggests that these two opposing forces are locked in an eternal dance, and that the date of January 30th is not just a historical footnote, but a permanent mirror held up to the world, asking us which path we will choose. Of all the stories of fortunate accidents that have shaped our world, few are as profoundly consequential as the one that unfolded in a rather cluttered London laboratory in the late summer of 1928. The man at the center of it was Alexander Fleming, a Scottish bacteriologist known for his brilliant but somewhat messy working style. He was returning to his workspace at St. Mary's Hospital after a 2-week vacation with his family, and he faced the familiar task of sorting through a stack of Petri dishes he had left soaking in a tray of antiseptic. These dishes had been coated with Staphylococcus bacteria, and Fleming was in the process of discarding them to make room for new experiments. It was then that he noticed something peculiar about one particular dish. It had been contaminated by a spore of mold, likely drifting up from a mycology lab one floor below. But instead of being entirely ruined, this dish showed a stunningly clear zone around the greenish-blue mold where the bacteria had been utterly annihilated. The mold was producing a substance that was actively killing the deadly staph bacteria. With remarkable understatement, Fleming noted, "That's funny." He had just stumbled upon the world's first antibiotic, which he would later name penicillin. Fleming's genius was not in the accident itself, but in his willingness to recognize its significance where another scientist might have seen only a failed experiment. He devoted the next several months to investigating this mysterious mold, identified as Penicillium notatum. He found that the broth it grew in, which he called mold juice, was incredibly potent. It could kill a wide range of disease-causing bacteria, yet was remarkably non-toxic to human cells. He presented his findings in a paper in 1929, but the scientific community largely shrugged. The substance was frustratingly difficult to produce in large quantities, and it seemed to lose its potency very quickly. For a decade, penicillin remained little more than a laboratory curiosity, a fascinating footnote in medical journals with no practical application. Fleming, ever the pragmatic scientist, eventually moved on to other work, though he carefully preserved his original mold strain, a quiet act of faith in his discovery. The story of penicillin, however, was far from over. Its potential was truly unlocked by another remarkable coincidence of timing and necessity, the outbreak of the Second World War. With thousands of soldiers dying not from their wounds directly, but from subsequent bacterial infections like gangrene and sepsis, the Allied forces were desperate for a way to keep their troops alive. In 1939, a team of scientists at the University of Oxford, led by the brilliant Howard Florey and the biochemist Ernst Chain, stumbled upon Fleming's old research papers. Intrigued, they took up the monumental challenge that had stymied Fleming, mass-producing penicillin. Their work was a Herculean effort conducted under the constant threat of bombing raids. They used every container they could find: bedpans, milk churns, food tins to grow the finicky mold, eventually developing methods to extract and purify the antibiotic in usable quantities. Their first human trial in 1941 was a stunning success, saving the life of a policeman who was dying from a horrific infection. It was clear they had a miracle drug, but one they couldn't yet make enough of. The scale of the war provided the impetus for a solution. The United States government, recognizing that penicillin could save countless Allied lives and literally change the course of the war, threw its immense industrial might behind the project. The War Production Board enlisted the help of major pharmaceutical companies, and what had been a painstaking laboratory process was transformed into a massive manufacturing operation. Scientists scoured the globe for more productive strains of the mold, eventually finding a cantaloupe in a Peoria, Illinois market that yielded a variant far more efficient than Fleming's original. By D-Day in June 1944, enough penicillin had been produced to treat every single Allied soldier wounded in the Normandy landings, a feat that undoubtedly saved tens of thousands of lives and contributed directly to the war effort. A drug born from a stray spore in a London lab had become a weapon as crucial as any tank or plane. This story of penicillin is the ultimate testament to the role of serendipity in science, but it's a specific kind of serendipity. It wasn't just blind luck, it was what scientists call prepared chance. Fleming was prepared to see the importance of a contaminated dish because of his years of dedicated work in bacteriology. The Oxford team was prepared to develop it because of their expertise in chemistry and their urgent desire to aid the war effort. This pattern of a prepared mind meeting a fortunate accident repeats throughout history. Wilhelm Röntgen discovered X-rays because he noticed a mysterious glow from a chemically coated screen while working with cathode ray tubes. The discovery of the microwave oven came from an engineer noticing a candy bar melting in his pocket near radar equipment. In each case, a curious and knowledgeable individual encountered an unexpected result and had the insight to pursue it rather than dismiss it. The impact of this one coincidence, this one bit of mold, ripples far beyond the battlefields of World War II. It single-handedly launched the era of modern antibiotics, transforming medicine from a profession often limited to comfort care into one capable of curing deadly infectious diseases. It made possible complex surgeries, organ transplants, and cancer treatments that suppress the immune system, all of which rely on antibiotics to prevent opportunistic infections. It fundamentally reshaped human demographics and life expectancy. Yet, this incredible power also carries a profound irony. Our overuse of this accidental gift has led to the rise of antibiotic-resistant bacteria, a growing crisis that some medical experts fear could return us to a pre-antibiotic era. The story of penicillin, therefore, is not just a tale of a happy accident. It is a continuous narrative about the double-edged sword of scientific discovery, a reminder that even our greatest breakthroughs can have unintended consequences, challenging us to be not just smart in our innovations, but also wise in their application. Sometimes the most profound shifts in human culture begin not with a revolution or a discovery, but with a distant subterranean rumble. On the evening of April 10, 1815, on the island of Sumbawa in the Dutch East Indies, Mount Tambora began a volcanic eruption of almost unimaginable scale. It was the most powerful such event in recorded human history, a cataclysm that would reverberate around the globe for years to come. For 4 days, the mountain tore itself apart, sending columns of ash and rock 30 miles into the atmosphere and unleashing pyroclastic flows that incinerated the surrounding countryside, killing tens of thousands instantly. The sound of the explosion was heard over 1,000 miles away, mistaken for distant cannon fire. But the true impact of Tambora was only just beginning its journey, as it began to seed the stratosphere with millions of tons of sulfur dioxide aerosols. These tiny particles began a slow, invisible migration around the planet, forming a veil that would filter and scatter the sun's rays. By the following year, 1816, this atmospheric shroud had fully encircled the Earth, and the consequences were nothing short of biblical. In Europe and North America, the spring and summer months simply failed to arrive. In place of warmth and sun, there was a persistent, chilling, overcast and relentless cold rain. Frost blackened fields in June and July. Snow fell in New England in August, with reports of lakes and rivers still frozen solid in the middle of what was supposed to be summer. Crops rotted in the waterlogged ground or were killed by the unseasonable cold, leading to catastrophic harvest failures. The price of staple foods like oats and wheat skyrocketed, triggering widespread famine, food riots, and a massive wave of migration as starving families fled the countryside for cities or embarked for America in search of arable land. It was a global climatic crisis sparked by a single geological event on a remote Indonesian island. It is within this context of pervasive gloom and hardship that we find one of the most extraordinary cultural coincidences in history. That same miserable summer, a group of literary friends found themselves trapped indoors by the incessant cold and rain at a villa on the shores of Lake Geneva in Switzerland. The party included the celebrated poet Lord Byron, his personal physician John Polidori, the poet Percy Bysshe Shelley, and his soon-to-be wife, the 18-year-old Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin. With the weather too dismal for the usual outdoor pursuits, Byron proposed a contest to pass the time. He challenged each of his guests to write the most terrifying ghost story they could conceive. The atmosphere was perfect for such a macabre endeavor. The group spent their days huddled by the fire, reading aloud from a collection of German ghost stories, while outside, the unnatural darkness and unending storms made it feel as though the world itself was ending. It was from this fertile ground of shared anxiety and grim inspiration that Mary Shelley's masterpiece Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus, was born. The novel's genesis was not a sudden flash of inspiration, but a gradual unfolding from the discussions that filled that villa. Conversations between Byron and Shelley about the nature of life, the principles of electricity, and the possibility of reanimating the dead captivated Mary's imagination. She later described how the idea came to her in a waking dream, a vivid vision of a pale student of unhallowed arts kneeling beside the thing he had put together, seeing the hideous phantasm of a man stretched out, and then on the working of some powerful engine show signs of life. The environmental despair of the year without a summer seeped into the very bones of her story. Frankenstein is a novel drenched in atmosphere, its scenes playing out against a backdrop of Arctic wastes, violent storms, and sublime, terrifying landscapes that mirrored the real-world chaos just outside her window. The book's central theme, a brilliant man's ambition unleashing an uncontrollable force that brings devastation upon him, can be read as a powerful allegory for humanity's fraught relationship with a powerful and unpredictable natural world. Yet the artistic innovation sparked by that gloomy summer did not end with Mary Shelley. Lord Byron himself wrote a fragment of a story about a vampire, which his physician, John Polidori, then expanded into a novella titled The Vampire. Published in 1819, it was a sensational success and is widely considered the first work of fiction to introduce the modern, aristocratic vampire archetype into popular culture, a direct forerunner to Bram Stoker's Dracula. In this way, the forced confinement caused by Mount Tambor's eruption directly gave birth to two pillars of the horror genre, the science-gone-wrong monster and the seductive, undead aristocrat. The cultural impact of that single volcanic event was to shape Gothic literature for the next 2 centuries. Beyond the realm of art, the practical desperation of the year without a summer also acted as a powerful catalyst for scientific and technological innovation. The desperate need for reliable transportation that was not dependent on fodder for horses, which had become prohibitively expensive due to the oat famine, is cited by many historians as a key impetus behind the rapid development of the bicycle. Most significantly, the suffering and starvation prompted a massive wave of migration from Europe to the United States, particularly from Germany and Ireland. This influx of people provided a new pool of labor and ambition that would help fuel America's westward expansion and its industrial revolution. The environmental catastrophe, in a bizarre twist of fate, helped populate and power the very nation that would soon emerge as a global leader. The story of 1816 is a profound lesson in interconnectedness. It demonstrates how a geophysical event in one corner of the world can directly influence cultural production in another, how a global climate anomaly can force a group of writers indoors and, in doing so, permanently alter the landscape of Western literature. It shows that from the deepest hardship can spring the most remarkable creativity and innovation. The ash cloud from Tambora brought darkness and death, but it also brought forth a timeless story that continues to make us question the limits of science, the responsibilities of creation, and the very nature of humanity itself. It is a stunning coincidence that a volcanic winter would give us some of our most enduring stories of monsters, a permanent reminder that even in the coldest and darkest of times, the human imagination can still find a way to create something monumentally and forever alive. And so we come to our final coincidence, a moment not of ancient prophecy or personal fate, but of collective euphoria that brought down a concrete symbol of division and seemingly aligned the cosmos itself. The fall of the Berlin Wall on November 9, 1989, was one of the most joyous and unexpected events of the 20th century, a spontaneous surge of people power that effectively ended the Cold War. For 28 years, the wall had been more than just a barrier of concrete and rebar. It was a physical manifestation of the Iron Curtain, a grim dividing line between East and West, freedom and oppression, that had literally split a city and a world in two. Its sudden opening was the result of a cascading series of mistakes, mounting political pressure, and a breathtaking failure of communication that turned a bureaucratic announcement into a historical avalanche. The story of that night is a masterpiece of historical accident. It began with a relatively minor policy change intended to slightly ease travel restrictions from East Germany. At a press conference, a weary and perhaps unprepared official, Günther Schabowski, was handed a note outlining the new rules. When asked by a reporter when these regulations would take effect, Schabowski, fumbling through his notes, ad-libbed the now legendary phrase, "As far as I know, effective immediately without delay." This live broadcast was seen by thousands of East Berliners, who immediately began gathering at the border crossings in massive, peaceful crowds. The bewildered and outnumbered border guards, receiving no clear orders from their paralyzed superiors, faced an impossible choice: open fire on their own people or open the gates. They chose the latter, and in doing so, they opened history. Yet, for those who look for deeper patterns in the fabric of time, the date itself, November 9th, holds a powerful and eerie resonance in German history. It is a date that seems to be a vortex pulling both darkness and light into its orbit. On November 9th, 1918, Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated, marking the end of the German Empire and the birth of the Weimar Republic. On November 9th, 1923, Adolf Hitler launched his infamous beer hall putsch in Munich, a failed coup that nonetheless catapulted him to national prominence and set the stage for his eventual rise to power. And most horrifically, on November 9th, 1938, the Nazi regime orchestrated Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, a nationwide pogrom that saw the destruction of synagogues, Jewish-owned businesses, and homes, an event that signaled the violent shift from discrimination to outright persecution and the beginning of the Holocaust. That the wall, the ultimate symbol of a divided Germany born from the ashes of World War II and the Nazi era, would fall on this very same date is a coincidence so profound it feels almost poetic. For many Germans, it was as if history itself was offering a form of redemption, a chance to reclaim November 9th from its association with hatred and violence and transform it into a day of unity, freedom, and hope. It provided a powerful, symbolic closing of a tragic circle, allowing a nation to confront its darkest chapter on the very day it embraced a new, brighter future. The date is no longer a somber memorial to Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, but a global celebration of broken concrete. Beyond the numbers on the calendar, some astrologers and enthusiasts of the esoteric have pointed to another layer of pattern seeking on that fateful day. They note that the planetary alignment on November 9th, 1989, was exceptionally rare and potent. Most significantly, it featured a grand conjunction of planets in Capricorn, the sign associated with structures, governments, authority, and boundaries. The very presence of Saturn, Pluto, and Uranus, all in close proximity in that sign, is interpreted as a cosmic recipe for the monumental collapse of old, rigid systems and the sudden, revolutionary overthrow of established power. Astrologically, it was a configuration screaming for radical, irreversible change, a celestial green light for the people to tear down the ultimate symbol of Capricornian control. Now, it is crucial to approach this with a friendly, informal curiosity rather than a claim of definitive causation. There is no scientific evidence that the gravitational pull of distant planets directly caused a political officer to misread a memo. The real, tangible causes were human: decades of courageous protest, the policies of Mikhail Gorbachev, the relentless pressure of thousands of East Germans fleeing through Hungary, and the sheer, undeniable will of the people who gathered at those checkpoints. Yet, the fact that this human triumph occurred under such a dramatically charged astrological sky is a delightful and thought-provoking footnote. It demonstrates our enduring desire to map our biggest, most chaotic human events onto a larger, ordered cosmos to see our history reflected in the movements of the stars. In the end, the fall of the Berlin Wall stands as the perfect final example for our journey through history's strange patterns. It reminds us that the most powerful coincidences are often a blend of the deeply human and the tantalizingly symbolic. The real magic wasn't in the stars or the date, but in the faces of those who climbed the wall, embraced strangers from the other side, and danced in the glow of a freedom they never thought they'd see. The astrological alignments and the numerological echoes of November 9th provide a fascinating, poetic frame for the story, a way to marvel at the strange symmetry of it all. But the true force that changed the world that night was something much simpler and far more powerful. It was the overwhelming, unscripted, and joyous human desire to be free. And that is a power that needs no planets to align, only courage to awaken. From the shared final breaths of founding fathers to the shared DNA of separated twins, from a cursed automobile to a world-altering mold, we've journeyed through 25 of history's most baffling and intricate patterns. These aren't just simple quirks of fate, they are moments where the timeline of our world seems to fold back on itself, creating echoes and synchronicities that defy simple explanation. We've seen assassinations and presidencies rhyme across a century, watched as fiction predicted tragic reality, and stood in awe as the very heavens seemed to choreograph moments of profound human change. Each story, in its own unique way, challenges the comforting idea that history is a straightforward, predictable march from one event to the next. Instead, these coincidences suggest a far more mysterious and interconnected reality. They hint at a tapestry of time where threads cross and recross in ways we can scarcely comprehend, where the lives of individuals and the destinies of nations can be woven together by forces that feel anything but random. It makes you wonder if the concepts of chance and destiny are truly opposites, or if they are two sides of the same inexplicable coin, working in tandem to create a story far richer and more complex than we could ever write ourselves. This is where the conversation turns to you. History isn't just something we read about, it's something we're all a part of, and many of you have undoubtedly encountered your own strange moments of synchronicity. Maybe you've discovered a personal connection to a major historical event, or perhaps your family has a story that seems to defy all logic. I would love to hear about it. Share your favorite historical coincidences in the comments below. Let's see what other incredible patterns our community can uncover together. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into the mysteries of our past, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Our channel is dedicated to exploring the unexplained, from historical enigmas and scientific anomalies to the greatest mysteries of the human experience. There's so much more to discover, and we're just getting started. As we close, we're left with one final, lingering thought, a question that has haunted philosophers and scientists alike. Are these astonishing patterns we've explored today nothing more than the inevitable output of probability, the statistical certainties that emerge when you have billions of lives interacting over thousands of years? Or are they glimpses of something more profound, subtle signatures of a deeper order woven into the fabric of the universe itself? Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between, in the beautiful, humbling idea that while chance may write the rules, it is meaning that we, as humans, bring to the game. These coincidences matter because they remind us that our story is still being written, full of mystery, connection, and the thrilling possibility that nothing is ever quite as random as